Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, their.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 6th and 7th Sundays after Epiphany, as well as Transfiguration Sunday, which is always the last Sunday after Epiphany before the beginning of Lent. We do have one content note for you this episode. For our last Sunday, Transfiguration Sunday, in this episode, for the second reading, we will have a conversation about antisemitism. If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, HP at Church. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Our first Sunday is the 6th Sunday after Epiphany, which falls on February 17th this year. The first reading is Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 through 10. The prophet reminds the people that humans betray and distort, but God is always faithful and trustworthy. One of the obvious themes for this passage is trust, and I think that my default lately has been going back to Dumbledore's speech at the end of Book 4 and his speech at the beginning of Book 5, where he talks about the importance to trust one another and to commit even more to trusting one another, because one of the things that Voldemort does is sow distrust, and that's how he gains power.
They are good speeches.
It's true.
When we reach verse 5, I was trying to think of an example of someone in the Harry Potter books who made flesh their strength. And I don't really think that Voldemort counts, even though he did try to make himself a new body several different ways. So I then thought about the second task of the Triwizard Tournament and Victor Crumb turning his head from a regular person's head into a shark head. And that kind of felt like he was making flesh his strength, and it seemed to actually work out pretty well for him. I mean, he didn't come in last.
True.
So it could have been worse, but that's not really what the verse is saying that
I feel like
making flesh your strength will do for you.
Yeah, I feel like it's more like the Slytherin team in Harry's second year, when they totally switch up the team, so it's all of the biggest guys, and then Malfoy because he bought all the brooms, but
right.
That's really trusting in their flesh and in their strength, when what they need is also agility and cohesion and analytical thinking.
Sure. Having actual aim. Comes in handy, I understand, in some sports.
I hear that. Having aim. I also thought for verse 5, I was thinking when Jeremiah starts quoting God saying, "Cursed are those who trust in mere mortals." And you went with the "make flesh their strength." But I was caught up in the "cursed are those who trust in mere mortals," and thinking about Dumbledore and the number of people who trust in Dumbledore. Among them, his own brother Aberforth, who, is forced to trust Dumbledore, right? Because he's the oldest brother. But then also thinking about the ways that Harry trusts Dumbledore and the number of people that get hurt because they trust Dumbledore. I guess I'm channeling Aberforth right now in my don't trust Dumbledore.
Yeah. It might work out well for the world, but it might not work out well for you. In verses 6 through 8, I feel like there has to be a herbology parallel for this passage. I looked into it a bit, and Ms. Rowling references Culpepper's Complete Herbal at one point in the series, which you can actually read online, and we'll put a link to that in our notes on the blog. And so I looked through Culpepper just for fun, because this is a fairly ancient text, and man, some of the things that he says about plants are so totally not true. The one shrub that Culpepper mentions that could conceivably grow in a desert is juniper, and the obvious choice for a tree by a stream is a willow. Now, I won't mention what Culpepper thinks that these plants can do, because, wow, they really don't, and also please don't treat yourself by his advice instead of going to actual doctors. Please go to actual doctors. In Harry Potter, there is, of course, the Whomping Willow, which goes nicely with the willow tree next to a stream. And juniper is sometimes also called cedar, which is a type of wood used for a wand. And according to the Harry Potter lexicon, a person with a cedar wood wand has strength of character and unusual loyalty. And Ollivander says that he would be kind of intimidated by them.
Interesting. I didn't realize that juniper and cedar were.
I was surprised by that too.
Yeah.
I always thought of juniper as a shrub and cedar as a tree,
Yeah.
but there are different varieties, but they are definitely closely enough related that some of the varieties are called by both names. So,
Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking about the different plants in Harry Potter as well, and I was thinking about the giant tree in verse 8 that's planted by the water. And while the Whomping Willow is not necessarily planted by the water, it's planted over an escape route out of Hogwarts. It is like definitely a tree that does not fear. Like there is no fear in that tree. It will take on anything, including a flying car.
yeah. Yeah, how many trees survived an attack by the Death Eaters?
At least one,
Yes.
for sure.
Our second passage for this Sunday is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 12 through 20. Paul reminds the people of Corinth that you can't believe Jesus was raised from the dead, but that we won't be, because our resurrection is based on Jesus's. This passage seems like a decent place to mention that I was always kind of surprised when we got into the last book in particular. It didn't seem like Ms. Rowling ever really used the concept of inferi as fully as she could have. Like, I was always expecting that to be like Chekhov's gun, like it was going to show up again later. And we sort of saw it with Harry and Dumbledore in the cave, right?
Yeah.
But that was about it, and I was expecting more than that. Are we expecting them to be a direct correlation to zombies, or is there something else going on there? Or
Yeah, well, and it is. I don't know the gun thing, but I imagine it's mentioned in the beginning and then it comes back and somebody uses it to do
Right.
something. Yeah, and it is like there is that sense within the sixth book, right? Because Snape talks about it at the beginning of Defense Against the Dark Arts that year or somewhere in the class, and then it doesn't come back until they're in the cave. But yeah, I would think that it would come back more. I don't think of it as exactly the same as zombies because there's some extent to which it feels like zombies have just a little bit of like free will left, and these are just enchanted dead bodies.
Okay. The Chekhov's gun thing, which I should have explained, is a kind of a storytelling trope. It's actually a reference to how to stage a play. The idea is that if there is a gun on the stage during the first act, then it has to be fired by the third. It's not necessarily true with all types of storytelling, but if you're going to set up props and a set for a play, you definitely want every piece that's there to do something. You don't really have a lot of extraneous crap lying around.
True. That makes sense. So I don't think that J.K. Rowling was following that rule because, I mean, she was for like the Deluminator, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that she shows up in the first or second books even, and then later on it shows up and manages to be really important later. I mean, even the invisibility cloak.
Which we'll get to in more detail. But yeah, I don't think that the Inferi are... Yeah, she really could have done a better job. Like, she could have had like an Inferi army be the ones to first start attacking Hogwarts even.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying she has to use every single concept that she throws in the books, because if she does, then eventually you run out of things to talk about. You can't have all that much stuff going on.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things I kind of expected to come back, and then it didn't.
Yeah. So. I mean, part of me is like, well, of course it didn't, because Voldemort was actually there, and there's no way he would be anywhere near Inferi, because he's terrified of death.
Yeah, that's true.
So I was thinking about resurrection and being raised from the dead and stuff, and I didn't go the zombie route or the Inferi route, but I was thinking about whether or not raising the dead and resurrection are the same in Harry Potter,
Mm.
right? Because in First Corinthians, Paul seems to be using them interchangeably.
Right. Well, and for Christians, we have resurrection and resurrection. Like there's the lowercase and the uppercase version. The uppercase is about Jesus. The lowercase is everybody else.
Interesting. I
Right.
never made quite that same distinction. I was thinking like resurrection is like the big one, but there's all sorts of like little resurrections that happen throughout our lives and throughout the world.
Sure.
I don't think, despite the poor choice of wording naming for the resurrection stone, I don't actually think resurrection and raising the dead are the same in Harry Potter because there is a clarity about being able to raise the dead, but not to resurrect the dead. Right? Like Harry can raise the dead with a resurrection stone. He can flip it 3 times, and his parents and Sirius and Lupin all come back, but they're not actually resurrected. It's just a
Right.
shadow of themselves.
On the other hand, I can totally see like the ancient person who first came up with it, naming it that just to be creative about it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and it makes like it sounds way better than the raising the dead, the shadow of the dead stone.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the official name of it was, but in the TV series Torchwood, there was a glove or a gauntlet that could bring someone back from being dead, and they came up with an official name for it. But at one point, they were just kind of trying to brainstorm names, and Ianto came up with calling it the Risen Mitten, and everyone basically shot him a look, and then they never spoke of it again. But in my head, it's been the Risen Mitten ever since.
That's
So,
fantastic. Was it a
yeah.
gauntlet or was it the doctor's hand that, like the one hand that fell off during?
No, that only brought him back, not
Okay,
anybody else.
that's what I was like.
Because there
This
were
is no
actually
matter.
two of these gloves, and the other one makes an appearance later. But
Ah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's been a while since I watched
me
Torchwood.
too.
The other thing that I noticed in this passage as is there's kind of a slightly like condescending tone that I interpret in this of as if Hermione were explaining something to Ron and Harry where she's like, "Don't you see? This is what's happening." Or like, "Don't you see? This is what Umbridge is saying in her opening speech." Or where she's just like, "How are you so oblivious to what is going on? It is obvious that this is the case. Here, let me explain it in very simple terms for you." And I feel like that's what Paul is doing.
Yeah, yeah, he is not, as we have pointed out once or twice before, he is not the greatest with arrogance. Everybody has a failing, or more than one.
Mm-hmm.
So, so when we reach verse 17, and Paul is talking about Christ's resurrection being the crux, the cornerstone, the one thing that the whole Christian faith hangs on, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
to have that or else none of it means anything. And I was kind of thinking that for the Harry Potter books, the crux would be Voldemort's return. If you don't have that, if that isn't actually true, if Harry really is just making it up, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that by now someone has written a fan fiction, although I haven't seen one personally, where Harry actually was wrong and Voldemort hadn't come back.
Mm-hmm. That would be really
But
boring.
it might be a really interesting exploration of mental illness, but that's about as far as that goes. But yeah, if you didn't have that one piece, then the whole set of books is kind of pointless, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way to explain how important Christ's actual resurrection, actually coming back from the dead and being alive again, is to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
As
The kind of sad part, though, is that the thing that's the crux for Christianity is this like really great positive resurrection, and the thing that is the crux
yeah,
for
that's
Harry
fair.
Potter is Voldemort's resurrection.
I mean, I suppose you could say that the crux of Harry Potter is that Harry can actually defeat him again. Because I suppose you could have a series of books where Harry loses at the end, but I don't think they would have been marketed to kids.
Mm-hmm.
Although it totally sounds like the kind of dystopia that would have been very popular a couple of years after the Harry Potter series started, because we got
Mm-hmm.
a whole boatload of young adult dystopias at that point.
Yeah, I actually love young adult dystopias. They're one of my favorite genres. they meet me where I'm at with the world is terrible and we're all gonna die, and they take me to somewhere that's slightly more hopeful with still recognizing the problematic stuff that's never gonna go away.
Yeah, I can't quite go there myself. I need a little bit more hope than that in my media content right now.
That's fair. I have not been reading young adult dystopias recently, to be clear. That's too real right now.
Yeah.
There's real and then there's really real.
Yeah.
Well, and it kind of fits better to have it be Harry's ability to defeat Voldemort again because of like timing wise where the story ends, but
True. Except for the epilogue. If you take the epilogue as canon, which not everyone does.
right. But I do think that it is more Voldemort coming back than Harry being able to defeat Voldemort again.
Yeah.
I think the books could have ended with Harry losing. Like defeating Voldemort, but like not living.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been sad.
Mm-hmm. It would have been sad, but it would have been like a feasible possibility, and it still could have been the story.
So who would Ginny have married then? No, sorry, we don't actually need to write that fanfic during
Hermione.
our podcast episode. Oh, people have written it. It exists.
Oh no, I know. I'm a fan of Ginny and Hermione.
Mm.
Verse 19 makes me think about Harry when he and Ron and Hermione come back to Hogwarts. Right. So verse 19, Paul's talking about if for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. It's like this life is so small, and that if that's all our hope is for or based on, like we're totally missing the larger picture. And I think about when Harry and Ron and Hermione get back and they go in through the room of requirement, and everybody thinks that they're back to like take on Snape, and they're like, oh no, like we're not here to like fight for Hogwarts. We're here to like end this thing and take care of this whole war. And so then it's like a whole bigger thing than what folks had anticipated.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 6 verses 17 through 26. Jesus heals a crowd and tells them who is blessed by God and who has woe approaching. This whole gospel and the way that Jesus frames things is just kind of a blessed are the oddballs, the outcasts, the weirdos. There's actually this great so it's called the Beatitudes is what we call them. And there's a great one that's very queer that I absolutely love. It has a variety of language, so maybe not suitable for work, but we'll include a link to that in our blog.
See, and when you said that, the first two things that came to mind were, for me, were the Island of Misfit Toys from Rudolph. And there's a song from the Disney musical Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I have never actually seen the whole movie.
Me either.
But there's a song from it that I've heard that's something like Blessed Are the Outcasts.
Oh!
And
yes!
Yeah. I think I actually learned about that song through fan fiction. I think it was an X-Men fanfic. But anyway.
Yeah. And those are the people that actually help Harry, right? Especially like in Order of the Phoenix against Umbridge, it's Neville and Luna and Ginny. And
yeah. So in verses 20 through 22, we get Jesus's list of those who are blessed. And if I was going to rewrite these to be more Harry Potter themed, I might say, blessed are the Weasleys, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed is Harry, for he will be filled. Blessed is George, for he will laugh. Blessed are the Muggleborns, for surely their reward is great in heaven.
Ah, that's beautiful. I really like that.
Yeah.
I actually really like these retellings that we've done a couple of now.
Sure.
Of what if we made this Harry Potter-ish?
Because if we think about this, when we ask ourselves who is poor in Harry Potter, the Weasleys immediately jump to mind. When we ask ourselves who is hungry, Harry is the first one we see hungry, and again and again and again in the books.
Yeah.
And George is definitely the mourning one that sticks with you. I mean, even if we don't actually see him do it much,
yeah.
Wow.
He can never again perform a Patronus. Like, that's big.
Yeah. And then for those who are reviled and hated, well, the Muggleborns, that's actually kind of the point of the books. So.
Yeah. That is definitely one of the. Those are really good. I don't even have anything to add. I just want to say
Aw.
multiple times that I love those. So when I was reading about the woes, I couldn't help but think about the woes of Mrs. Weasley, which is a chapter in Order of the Phoenix when Mrs. Weasley tries to get rid of the boggart on her own, which, of course, everybody knows you can't get rid of a boggart on its own. But also, the woes of Mrs. Weasley in that case are everyone dead. Um, and it's just such a different it's a different sense than either the blesseds or the woes in this
Yeah.
passage, right? It's
Well, and she lost Gideon and Fabian in the First War, right? That's who
mm-hmm.
George and Fred are sort of quasi named after.
I didn't realize that. That makes
Oh,
sense.
okay.
Because
Another thing fandom taught me.
he
I
and
There
mm-hmm.
are various theories as to why she changed the names. Like George and Fred are just more classic, and also all of the Weasley boys are named after British kings.
Right. Yeah,
The
that would
G and the F twins.
make sense. Yeah. So she knows. I mean, it's woes she knows about, and maybe it's the morning that again she'll laugh. There's an aspect of that to it, but it's
Yeah.
yeah. I definitely think she's
And I think she will
yeah.
one day.
Oh yeah, and I think she does. Even after that, she laughs at her to us.
And if I were going to rewrite the woes, I might say, woe to the Malfoys, for they have received their consolation. Woe to Horace Slughorn, for he will be hungry. Woe to the Death Eaters, for they will mourn and weep. Woe to the ministers of magic, for they are treated as your ancestors did the false prophets. Because the Malfoys are rich, and Horace Slughorn. I was trying to think of who in the books always seemed to be full, and
Mm-hmm.
we always seem to see Slughorn at a meal. I mean, what with
Yeah.
the Slug Club and all. And the Death Eaters are definitely really freaking self-righteous and happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ministers of Magic are lauded and applauded despite not actually doing their jobs.
Which is, the false prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought when I was reading verse 26 about woe to you when all speak well of you, I was thinking also about a particular minister of magic. But I was thinking about Fudge in Order of the Phoenix when he is talking about Malfoy and how great Malfoy is and how he's given lots of money and he has meetings with Malfoy and all of this stuff, and he just speaks so well of Lucius Malfoy.
Yeah.
And you're just like, he's a Death Eater and he's playing you.
Yeah.
And he got played. Big time.
Yeah. Our second Sunday for this episode is the seventh Sunday after Epiphany, which this year falls on February 24th. Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 45, verses 3 through 11 and verse 15. But when we link to this passage on our blog, the link includes the missing verses 12 through 14. Joseph, years after being betrayed by his brothers, reveals himself to them, and that he has great power in Egypt, and will keep them and their families safe during the famine.
I think Joseph's situation reminds me a lot of Snape and of the situation that Snape's in. It's just a terrible situation, but it's a terrible situation on so many different levels, right? Joseph
Mm-hmm.
has been sold into slavery. His brothers were going to kill him. Then he was sold into slavery, and then he was sexually assaulted and accused of sexual assault and all of this stuff. And then he finally gets to the place where he's at and encounters his brothers again. And Snape has just done so much, right? He betrayed the one he claims to love to her death, and then he is used and he uses others and he has to keep all of these secrets, and it's all this managing and mismanaging and all of that stuff, and it's just such a terrible way to live, to be constantly navigating and negotiating secrets and betrayal and use and utilitarianism and all of that.
Yeah. I once stage managed a production of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, the musical. And so now I can't really read these Bible passages without hearing the music. And also thinking about my seminary classmate Ben, who played Pharaoh with the Elvis accent and had the really excellent eyeshadow. And he died a few years later in the Haitian earthquake. Um, I love the fact that I will always remember him as Pharaoh with the Elvis accent and the excellent eyeshadow. And I think he'd like that. But on a lighter note, I also, now that we're doing this podcast and I read these passages again, now I want the Harry Potter twist on the musical, with Ron's brothers selling him off for being irritating and Ginny doing all the bits for Benjamin. Can't you see it? I mean, I'm especially thinking of the Those Canaan Days bit where all of the brothers get together and they do the French cabaret style song and sing sadly about how their life used to be wonderful and now it's terrible. And so, yeah, I just have this lovely mental image. I think Bill would be especially suited to that song.
Oh
He
my
could do
gosh.
the Reuben bit very nicely.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be hilarious.
Charlie as Simeon would have a bunch of dragons following him around. The twins would constantly be setting things on fire in the background just for fun.
Of course.
Um,
Of course.
yeah.
And Percy?
Percy would be kind of grudgingly taking part because he wouldn't like being stuck in famine either.
Yeah.
So
Right.
he
Would
would
be like
certainly, yeah,
the last one to come around.
probably. But I'm sure that once he really got into it, he would definitely have his moments. I have a feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
Especially with the sheer amount of wine that they apparently drink during that scene, at least in the movie version with Donny Osmond. So,
I mean, it seemed like they were drinking a fair amount.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the Bible. They do a lot of that. So,
That is true. Verse 5 in particular is one that I think gets used in harmful ways. And so I think it's important to be pretty clear about what God's role in all of this is, right? Like, God was not the one who sold Joseph into slavery.
correct. Yes.
Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him, and then, thanks to, I think, Reuben, sold him into slavery instead.
Because why not make a buck? That wasn't God's idea either.
Yeah. Well, no, it was that Reuben tried to say was going to go back for Joseph. So he was like, don't kill him outright. We'll just put him in a well. And then Reuben was going to go back. And then they're like, oh, let's sell him instead. And Reuben was like, oh, shoot. But so it's not God acting to send Joseph to Egypt so that down the road he can save his brothers. It's that even in all of the ways that Joseph's brothers mess up, and in all of the ways that we mess up, God still finds ways to act for good. Right? God uses even our worst things.
Yes.
God
can
use for good.
Like, I would say in this particular example, yes, Joseph winds up rich and powerful, but that doesn't mean that every bad thing that happens to anybody is going to wind up with them having a better life than they would have otherwise. Because that's not a promise either.
Yeah. But I think it reminded me of how Harry is really pretty good at compassion because he knows what it's like to be isolated and neglected from his time with the Dursleys. And so he is aware when other people feel isolated and neglected, and he doesn't always act on it, but there is this deep sense of compassion that I noticed with him.
Absolutely. When we reach verse 11, I ask myself, who would our Harry Potter friends turn to in a famine? Now, obviously, with the trio wandering in the forest and not having a lot to eat, Hermione does come to mind. But also, I think probably if it was a full-on famine, Neville would be pretty popular, what with his talent for herbology. Yeah.
Yeah. And, of course, Molly Weasley.
Well, yes, of course.
She does wonders with...
Not that much.
Yeah. Verse 15, actually, when Joseph kisses his brothers and weeps upon them, reminded me of Hermione and Ron's first kiss. Because they don't kiss until the very end, and it's not until after Ron is like, oh, but the house elves, and Hermione's like, what, to make them, or Harry's like, what, to make them help us? And Ron's like, no, we have to protect them and tell them to get out of here. And then Hermione's like, oh my gosh, you are like a human person with compassion, and you have grown, and you actually care about other people. and then she kisses him. And I can imagine just like that flood of like, you have changed. You are
the person I thought you could be.
Yep.
And that, of course, leads to one of my favorite lines in all 7 books, when Harry stands there and waits and waits and waits and finally says, "Oi, there's a war on!" I really love how every so often there is this fabulously hilarious line, because even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility for humor. So, but that's a hard balance to strike.
Yeah. And gallows humor is something that I think pastors know well.
Yeah, and Harry's pretty good at it. So, yeah. With his background, you'd expect that.
Mm-hmm. Our second reading for this Sunday is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 35 to 38 and 42 through 50, with the link including the missing verses. Paul explains the resurrection of the body at the end of time to the Corinthians using various metaphors.
Now, sometimes Emily and I have been known to complain a bit about verses missing out of various lectionary texts. In this particular case, it seems like they took out some of the verses just to allow the preacher to focus on a couple of the specific metaphors, because the missing verses just have yet more metaphors that Paul is using. But if you do want to include them, or take a look at them, verse 41 involves astronomy, which, of course, Hogwarts students study. So if you wanted to use that as a way to link to Harry Potter, I think knowing that each star is different, just as each of us is different, shows how much they were paying attention to astronomy 2,000 years ago. But, of course, remember, they didn't have Quidditch back then, so they had a lot more free time on their hands. Honestly, the number of times when I have been able to explain something to confirmation students by saying, well, of course they cared about that really deeply back then. They didn't have professional sports to deal with, so they had to put all that energy somewhere. It would amaze you.
Yeah. Well, and I think the naming of the different stars reminds me of all of the Black family names that everybody's named after constellations and stuff and stars, and so that reinforces it, right? Each person is different, even when they're named after a star or a constellation as a whole. They all have their unique points. I was thinking about this passage and thinking about the embodiment of the soul. This one's complicated, but thinking about Voldemort, especially at the end, after his soul has been torn into all of these different pieces, and the way that his soul is just this, like, ugly kind of baby, kind of not baby thing that's crying, and no one feels like compassion for it. It's just repulsion. But the way that the soul is embodied and the way that we embody ourselves.
Well, Christian theology is often mistaken for being that we have a body and we have a soul, and the two are essentially separate things, but that they happen to be in the same place during our lifetime. But then your body dies and your soul continues. But really, when you take a deeper look at Christian theology, especially Lutheran theology, especially with that whole resurrection of the body thing, they're not actually that separate. The body is way more important and way more lasting isn't exactly the word I want to use, but has more of an impact than a lot of American pop culture Christianity would have you think.
Yeah. And I think Paul is right that we don't know what it'll look like.
Right. Yeah, we don't know what our souls look like, but that doesn't mean our bodies don't matter.
Yeah. And I think J.K. Rowling feeds into this, like, problematic way of understanding resurrection, right? Because when she does it, both when she does it with Voldemort, but also with Harry, where Harry doesn't have any scars or anything like that, and it's like, well, what does it mean to have a perfectly whole body? Like, does it mean that you don't have any scars, or is it an integration of your scars into your wholeness? Right. Jesus resurrection. Jesus is still has the wounds from the cross,
but they're not actually bleeding generally.
I mean, we don't.
There are different theories, but that would have made eating fish on the beach after his resurrection kind of messy.
They might not be bleeding, but they also, like, it might still hurt to walk on them, right? Like,
yeah, that's true. Well, and when Harry comes back and he doesn't have his scars, but if I remember right, his eyesight is still not perfect, right? He still needs his glasses.
Well, yeah. I mean, he still has his scars when he comes back as in his bodily form. I mean, in King's Cross.
Oh, yes, okay. That makes more sense. Because, yeah, I thought he kept at least his lightning scar.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
No, yeah, he still has all of his scars. I was just talking about, like, the King's Cross place
Right.
where she gets rid of all of his scars and stuff.
Okay, so does he have glasses there? I mean, I know he's initially naked and then has to dream up his clothes.
Right. And the image at the top of the chapter, he's not wearing his glasses. It never mentions Harry's glasses, though Dumbledore still has his half moon spectacles. But because Dumbledore is a figment of Harry's imagination.
Yeah. J.K. Rowling stated in an interview that the reason she gave Harry glasses was that she wore them herself as a child and was fed up with reading books in which this bespectacled character was the brainy one, and she wished to read about a hero who wore glasses. Aw.
That's cute.
I appreciate that, as someone who wears glasses myself.
Mm-hmm.
There is a picture. Yes, okay, I found a picture of Harry in limbo with Albus Dumbledore, and neither Dumbledore or Harry are wearing glasses in this picture.
Interesting. I mean, Dumbledore is described as having spectacles.
Right.
Speaking of bodies, specifically in verses 36 to 38, I was thinking about the ways that bodies change and the ways that, right, Paul's talking about bodies being seeds that are planted and then become this other thing. And Archbishop Oscar Romero actually talked about that before he was assassinated, that if he was killed, it would be like a seed and he would be resurrected in the people and in the struggle. And then, so that got me thinking, as we briefly mentioned earlier in this episode, about the different seeds in Harry Potter. So, the Deluminator, for example, that is present in the first chapter of the first book, and then comes back in the seventh book in particular, for Ron, who receives it from Dumbledore in his will. Or Expelliarmus, right? When Snape teaches Harry Expelliarmus, and then that becomes the spell that ultimately he uses to defeat Voldemort.
And I love that you wanted to talk about planting seeds. This morning I was reading a devotion from one of the professors from my college, and they, at faculty meetings, one of the professors will usually lead a devotion before they start. And the one I was reading this morning, which the Spiritual Life Office decided to share on Facebook, was about the line attributed to Martin Luther, although we don't know whether he said it, of, if I knew I was going to die tomorrow, I would plant an apple tree today. And his devotion was about, even if we don't know whether or not Martin Luther said this, it's still a powerful line, it's still a useful thought. And as many of the faculty there are reaching the final years of their careers, and some have recently retired, it's helpful to think about the seeds that they've planted, and maybe no one else will know that they were the ones to plant those seeds, but that doesn't mean that the apple tree doesn't grow. And you may have planted trees you never knew you did.
Yeah.
But when you look back on your career, remember that the seed planting was a big part of it.
Yeah, that was actually one of the big things that we talked about when I was in my first call when we were closing the congregation. The synod voted to close the congregation, and that summer before we closed, a lot of the stuff that kept coming back to us were the seeds that were planted in the youth and in the people that were part of the faith community and in the community itself, in the ways that we planted seeds with our support of local organizations and that sort of thing. And it's a powerful image. Like, we even got seed paper so people could plant seed paper.
Oh,
it was really cool. I'm really proud of the way that we closed that congregation.
yeah.
But yeah. So verse 47 and 48, where Paul's talking about the first human was from the dust of the earth, the second human is from heaven. I love dust and stardust. My favorite Ash Wednesday blessing is not just "you are dust, and to dust you shall return," but "you are dust from the earth, and you are stardust scattered throughout the cosmos." I just love that, dust and stardust, and the ways that we can embody both. And I think that's part of the joy of the magical world is that it's an embodiment of both the really, really human stuff and this like magical spark of otherworldliness of magic, literally.
Yeah. It makes me think of that working model of the solar system that Harry saw in his first trip to Diagon Alley.
Mm-hmm.
When we reach verse 50, this is one of those moments where Paul is not being as clear about something as I would wish he would be. He's not doing a great job of explaining this bit because he makes it sound like our final form will be strictly spiritual in nature at the resurrection at the end of all time. Like Harry's parents coming out of Voldemort's wand, sort of translucent and ephemeral rather than physical, whereas as Lutherans and as Christians, we confess a bodily resurrection that is physical. Not that we necessarily understand exactly what that's going to look like or entail. But I have to admit that the American pop culture idea of the body and the spirit being completely separate and the spirit being the lasting part, there's bits of the Bible where that idea comes from. It's not like that's made up whole cloth. And this is one of those moments when Paul is not being terribly clear and helps that along.
Yeah. Oh, Paul.
Yeah. He has several moments where I say that, but, you know.
That is true. Me too.
Our gospel reading for our second Sunday of this episode is from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. Jesus preaches on the centrality of love, generosity, and resistance.
The theme that came up for me in this gospel and always comes up with this gospel reading, I actually really love this gospel reading.
Me too.
But the theme that came up for me was nonviolent resistance. So a lot of times we've been taught, I was taught growing up, I don't know if it was intentional or not, that turn the other cheek and giving away your coat, right? Those became like these become a doormat type of Bible passages, and that's not...
Yeah, I heard that one in Sunday school too.
Yeah, and that's not actually what they're about at all, right? Turn the other cheek makes the person who hit you the first time hit you the other way, which actually becomes a sign of respect for you. And
instead of backhanding you, they have to punch you if they're going to hit your other cheek.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then to give someone not only your coat, but also your shirt. If you are naked, the person who is shamed is actually anyone around you, not you. And so you would be shaming the person who's demanding your coat.
Because you're being generous. They're being miserly by demanding so much from you.
Yep. Yeah, and so I just love these ways of subverting and undermining these authorities, because a lot of them had to do with the Roman occupation at the time, right? But undermining this authority that's oppressing people and making it so that it's harder for them to take advantage of people. And so I was thinking about that in the ways that Neville in particular is into nonviolent resistance in the 7th book, right? He's the one leading the rebellion at Hogwarts, and when Harry, Ron, and Hermione all see him, they're like blown away with how haggard he looks, right? Like he looks like he has been through the ringer, because he has. And they're like, why would you mouth off to them? Why would you do that? And he's like, because it matters, because other people see it, and it encourages other students who are having a harder time. And it's like, that's part of what turning the other cheek is it's not necessarily just about the relationship between you and the person who backhanded you. It's about all of the other people around you who might witness that, right? I think about the number of times that we speak up against someone who's saying terrible things about queer people, right? Like, I will speak against you, and it has nothing to do with trying to change your opinion and everything to do with all of the people around us who are overhearing it and wondering if they are valued.
Right. Or the same thing with sexism or racism or ableism or any of the others. Yeah.
Also, I think Pooh is a good example of nonviolent resistance, because it's making fun of him without even, without being able to get in trouble. Like, you can't get in trouble for it.
There's no way to argue about it without
being ridiculous.
Saying that, Yeah.
So, speaking of the specifics of how this passage is used, right? on verse 29 when Jesus says, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. From anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. And as we look for an example of like the ways that this passage is harmful and is used harmfully, Dubby is like the best example, because Dubby would totally, right, he doubles down on punishment all on his own without even being prompted at this point. And he literally gives his life for Harry, but he would give anything for Harry. And so that's taking this out of context into an extreme that is unhelpful and unhealthy. So don't be like Dubby in this particular case. And then verse 31, this is maybe a hashtag controversial opinion, but I don't actually like the golden rule. I don't agree with it. So Jesus says, do to others as you would have them do to you. And that makes me think of Hermione and SPEW, SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. And she very much uses the golden rule. She wouldn't want to be enslaved, and so she does everything in her power to stop the enslavement of house elves. But she doesn't ask what they want. And yes, there's nuance and complications and a lack of understanding of slavery and racism by J.K. Rowling, but the golden rule only works to a point. And one of the things that somebody once upon a time introduced me to was the platinum rule, which is not do to others as you would have them do to you, but do to others as they would have you do to them. And it's the idea that we actually might know what is best for ourselves. And so you can take it on a big level of like charity and stuff. They did this great video once upon a time. I don't know that I can find it, but it's like the number of times that people from like the US or Europe are like trying to tell people in Africa how to fix problems, and so then they flip it and they have
Also, we're entirely wrong when we do that, but usually
right, which is so they flip it and they have people from Africa tell people in like I think it's the UK how to solve problems, and it's these like absurd solutions because that's what our solutions are to them. They're absurd and they're totally not contextual. And so that's where I think I prefer the platinum rule to the golden rule.
See, I've heard that interpretation of the golden rule before, but that differs significantly from the way that I was taught what the golden rule means. And the way it was illustrated to me as a kid involved Christmas presents. So I'll try to see if I can Harry Potterify this a bit. Okay, so if you're Harry Potter and you're trying to get a Christmas gift for Hermione, say, and you follow the golden rule, does that mean that Harry Potter gets Hermione a broom cleaning kit because he would like a broom cleaning kit? Or when he says to himself, when I treat Hermione the way that I would like to be treated, does that mean getting her exactly the gift that I want myself? Or does that mean getting her a gift that she would enjoy because I would want her to get me a gift that I would enjoy? And so then he would get her a book or something like that, right? It's a wider understanding of a deeper understanding of the golden rule, where it's not about doing precisely what you would want them to do for you, but instead going to a deeper level and saying, would this person probably what this person really wants is my respect, and so how would they like to be respected? Or what this person is really hoping for is to share joy with others, and so in what ways do they enjoy sharing joy, that kind of thing. Actually, looking back on how the golden rule was explained to me, you know what it sounds like to me now? It sounds like Luther expanding on the Ten Commandments in the Small Catechism. Mm-hmm. What does this mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that definitely has connection. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I totally get that problem with the golden rule, and by golly, if somebody interpreted it like that at me, then I would be frustrated. But I think my version is kind of a line between the golden rule and the platinum mm-hmm. rule, as you would put them, because I wouldn't quite go to do unto others as they would like you to, because sometimes that's going to take you bad places too.
Yeah, I mean,
so
always room for nuance.
Yeah. When we reach verse 32, I love this idea about how loving people who love you, sure, why not? But it's not gonna. Don't call it something special, because it's not. Or even the Malfoys can love people who love them. You know, that's a baseline. Anybody can do that kind of thing.
If the Malfoys can
If you
do
want to
it,
be
anybody
extraordinary,
can
you
do
have
it.
to go a little further. Yeah. So, and then when we reach verse 38, to connect this briefly to another fandom, I love verse 38, in part because the first time I ran into it, I was still fairly young, and I was reading Catherine Marshall's novel Christie, which was later turned into a television series that I have some issues with the production of, but whatever. And it's this lovely image of abundance in this verse, pressed down and overflowing. And it reminds me of Harry and Ron on the train with lapfuls of candy in the first movie.
Yes.
And I love that bit. So yeah, if there's a moment of that verse in the books or movies, I think that's where it shows up.
That is beautiful. I love that. Our final Sunday for this episode is Transfiguration Sunday, which falls on March 3rd this year. Transfiguration Sunday is always the last Sunday after Epiphany and the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. Just in case you were curious, no, we're not talking about classes with McGonagall. Nobody's turning buttons into beetles or beetles into buttons. Transfiguration is the time when Jesus goes up to a mountaintop and is transfigured, and we will talk about that a bit more when we get to the gospel reading. But our first reading for this Sunday is from Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 to 35. Moses returns to the people after receiving the commandments on Mount Sinai, and they see that as a result of his meeting God so directly, his face is shining. Which of course makes me think of shiny, I'm so shiny from Moana.
Yay.
A theme for this passage that I noticed was the theme of reverence. There's a lot of people who have reverence, so it's complicated feelings of fear and awe in response to Moses' face shining so much. And Moses is totally clueless, like doesn't even realize that his face is shining. And so I was thinking about the number of times, especially before Harry gets the letter from Hogwarts, the number of times that magical people come up, and even at the beginning of his time at Hogwarts, right, that magical people come up and just have this reverence for his scar and for him because they recognize him because of the scar. And Harry doesn't even notice, like doesn't even get why they're coming up to him or what the big deal is, right? When Ron's like, you have the scar, and then Harry's like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. By the end of even like the first month, he's like done with that. But at the very beginning where he's just like, I don't get what the big deal is, it's just like a cut that I got in the car accident that killed my parents.
Yeah. When we read verse 29, I'm reminded of a comment that I made last episode about how every time that Harry sees his parents in the book, whenever they appear in whatever way, they always seem to have shining faces when they look at him. And so, of course, Moses having the shining face reminds me of that. Last time I said everybody should have someone whose face shines like that when they look at them. But this time, I'd like to imagine having that look every time you speak with God.
Ooh.
Every time you pray, every time you sing, or however you prefer to speak with God. Personally, I think I'm often too frustrated with God to be able to have that kind of a shining face.
Definitely.
But imagine having the kind of life where you could. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah.
So. Maybe not every time, maybe just sometimes. But if we could have that look on our faces a bit more often when we talk to God, I think that would be good.
Yeah. And I think, as I mentioned, right, Harry not knowing about the importance of his scar for most of his life really is what it feels like in verse 29 for me with Moses. But your comment also got me thinking about what it would be like to not even realize the ways that you're changed, or to not be aware of this thing that makes people afraid and in awe at the same time. And
when we reach verse 34, I've always wondered about Moses and his use of the veil. Like, there are times when he's talking to the people where he wears the veil,
Mm-hmm.
but then there are times when he's sharing the word of God with people and then he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that part seems to make a certain amount of, like, he's consistent about that,
Mm-hmm.
so it makes some sense. But he never wears the veil with God, no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where the shining face is coming from. And so it feels like that is kind of implicitly giving us permission to have some privacy in our relationship with God.
Mm.
Because there are times when Moses is sharing everything he's got with the people,
Mm-hmm.
when he shares what God has said and what God is means for them to do. But there are also times when he doesn't quite have to share his entire self with the whole universe. He gets to keep a piece of himself to himself, or a piece of his reaction to his relationship with God to himself. Although when he speaks to God, he always shares everything he's got, because that's God, and really a veil isn't going to do you much good. So I think that makes a certain amount of sense, just like we try to have privacy in many of our closer or closest relationships. Unless, of course, you happen to have an amoral journalist who can also turn into a beetle stalking you. Sorry about that, Harry. But, yeah. We all have our sad, unfortunate moments of losing privacy, especially nowadays with social media. But
Yeah.
Harry being stalked by a journalist that can turn into a bug, I really hope that doesn't happen to any of our listeners, because that would be pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
So,
But hi NSA. It's nice to see you. Yeah. I do think like there's the delicate dance, right? That our relationship with God is personal, but it's also it can be private, but if it's just private, it doesn't work, right? Like Moses isn't
yeah, that
always keeping everything just between him and God because it's about the entire Hebrew people.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christianity is by necessity communal
Mm-hmm.
and community driven.
Mm-hmm. And even Harry and Dumbledore, right? They have a really close relationship to the point of like hunting down pieces of Voldemort's soul to kill them. But Harry still
Yeah.
shares it with a couple people, and Dumbledore even shares a little bit of it with Snape. And
Which, come to think of it, is actually a nice illustration for how relationships between adults and minors should, with the possible exception of parental relationships, but even then, really there should be an aspect of public nature to that. It shouldn't be entirely private. Usually, if a relationship between a adult and a minor is completely and totally private and secret, that's generally speaking a bad
yep,
sign.
even for parents, I think, right? Because
Yeah.
then you're keeping your kid at home and you're not allowing them to go anywhere. Problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which sadly happens.
Yep.
So just throwing that one out there for our younger listeners.
Yes, if you have a relationship with an adult and they never are ever in public with you, you should maybe talk to someone you trust who is not that person.
Yeah.
About it. Verse 34 also reminded me of the role of Moses and the role of Potterwatch. Or Potterwatch seems like the Moses of the Resistance in Deathly Hallows, right? Where it's the one that relays the information. It gathers so much of the information, especially because they're part of the order. So they have all of this information and then they share it with people, and they don't share everything, right? They talk about like, well, if Voldemort were actually spotted everywhere that everybody claims he's spotted, he'd be everywhere. And so it's like they pick and choose, and they're discerning in which information to share, but they do share reliable information for people so that people have some idea of what's going on, because none of the newspapers are reliable at that point.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12 through chapter 4, verse 2. Paul compares Moses' shining face to our reaction of hearing and believing the gospel.
One of the themes that came up for me in this reading from 2 Corinthians was the fear of offending, right? So I think Paul is kind of trying to like couch what he's saying, but also like encourage people to not be afraid of offending people if they're like following their faith and being faithful. And that made me think of Harry in Goblet of Fire after he and Ron finally make up, and then Ron makes a fool of himself and is terrible at the Yule Ball, and Hermione tells him off, and Ron's like, she she just doesn't understand. And Harry's like, inside his own head, is like, I think Hermione gets what's going on way better than you do, Ron. But he doesn't want to offend Ron. He doesn't want to ruin their relationship because they just got back to a good place in their relationship. And so he doesn't.
Harry is finally learning the gentle art of diplomacy, at least just a tiny bit.
Yeah, but he does it at the expense of Hermione. And, like,
he does.
Hermione wouldn't
like
do
I
that.
said, just a tiny bit.
Yeah, Hermione wouldn't do that. Like, you're throwing her under the bus. Also of note in this chapter is verses 14 through 16.
This is another one of those times when Emily and I were working completely separately and not talking to each other about it, and we still managed to pick the exact same verses to talk about. But we have very different comments to make, except for this first one. So,
except for this first one. Antisemitism is wrong and evil and sinful.
I agree.
And it would be really easy to take verses 14 to 16 and interpret them in a way that is anti-Semitic. Part of what we have to remember is that Paul is Jewish, so he's trying to work within his own culture and frame. And so when he talks about different things that we associate with Judaism, he associates it with himself as well, which is important to remember within this context. But I also was thinking that I kind of like an understanding of these verses as the ways that we rely on the Bible more than Jesus, right? So one of the things we talked about in one of my classes in college was that Jesus is the Word of God, not the Bible, right? Jesus is the actual Word of God.
Jesus is the first of the three expressions of the Word of God.
Right, but like hierarchically, Jesus...
And most importantly.
Yeah, Jesus is the Word of God. The Bible is like the cradle, right? It's the thing that holds Jesus and how we understand Jesus. It helps us understand
Jesus is the embodiment of the Word of God. The Holy Spirit is the Word of God active in the world, and the Bible is the written down, most basic, most stripped down. Yeah. There's a lot of nuance that the Bible can't hold, and the Bible holds a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
So
just imagine all the nuance that's out there.
The Bible is the least colorful version of the Word of God, and yet there's a lot of color and nuance and shades of many different things in the Bible. So.
Yeah. But it is, I think there are people in the world who hold the Bible to a higher standard or hold the Bible more highly than Jesus.
I've met people who seem to be worshiping not so much God as the Bible.
And that I think is what Paul is getting. Is to me, that's how I would read what Paul's getting at is it's about that. It's about Jesus. It's not about the Bible. It's not about this, like the Bible is literally is not God. And it kind of made me think of Umbridge and her educational decrees and her rules about how to do Defense Against the Dark Arts versus actual Defense Against the Dark Arts and actually learning Defense Against the Dark Arts, which is a whole different ballgame and so much richer to actually be learning and practicing Defense Against the Dark Arts than to be reading beginner's theories with no practice allowed.
Right. And another way to look at these verses is to understand that these are not verses written about the Jewish people in general throughout all of time and history. These are specifically talking about one set of people who were traveling with Moses, who kept, worshipping golden statues of calves and whining about how boring manna was and all kinds of other things. I mean, they just... There are a lot of groups of people in the Bible who just keep screwing up over and over and over again, and you can almost see God face-palming in the background. But this is one of them.
Yes. Also, can I just say that this time when you said statues of golden statues of calves or whatever, I thought of the Christmas Story movie and the lamp with the leg.
To explain the background of what Emily just said, I did make a comment before we started recording about whether I should explain that the golden calves that the Israelites in the desert were worshipping were not, in fact, statues of people's legs, but were rather of baby cows.
I think you should.
So,
and then we should find
concerned.
a picture of the lamp and put it on the blog.
Yes. Just like Captain Raymond Holt from Brooklyn Nine-Nine was once our picture. This time it can be the lamp from Christmas Story. That'll get us some interesting comments. Just like how in the Harry Potter books, just because some of the Slytherins are evil doesn't say anything about the House of Slytherin as a whole through all of time and space. Since all houses have evil people, although we don't actually see any of the Hufflepuff evil ones in the books so
Huh.
much. Not like Death Eater evil, just like
Is it possible for
less great.
Hufflepuffs to be evil?
I have met some very determined and loyal evil people.
Okay.
They are actually some of the scariest evil people.
Ooh, okay, I can see that. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, when a Hufflepuff turns evil, you really want to run the other direction.
It takes enough to make them turn evil that like it's just scary.
Yeah, once they go there, you're kind of screwed. So.
I do know a lot of Hufflewins or Slitherpuffs. It's amazing how connected those houses
Hufflepuff, yeah, there are some houses that don't seem to combine very well, but Hufflepuff can really combine with any of them.
Mm-hmm. Especially Slytherin. Like, there's the loyalty in like different ways loyalty plays out.
When we reach verse 2, which, just to be clear, is verse 2 in chapter 4, so this is the last verse of the reading, it's not earlier in the reading. Mm-hmm. You know, you could read this verse a few different ways. Is it saying that cunning itself is evil, which I guess would actually make the Slytherin house evil? Or is it just saying that it can lead there? Elsewhere in the Bible, one of the lines from the Bible that I have always enjoyed and appreciated is when we are instructed to be as wise as a serpent but as innocent as a dove. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 16, actually Jesus tells us to be as wise as a serpent but as innocent as a dove. And you can hold those two things in tension together and be both at the same time. Although it takes a very careful balancing act. But I would say that that's actually kind of what cunning is. Like, you're being as wise as a serpent. That part is the cunning part. But you can do that while also remaining innocent in what you do, just being kind of cunning about how you do it. I guess one of the examples for me would be how I learned to handle some of my assignments in college. I got very good at figuring out very quickly exactly what kind of papers and arguments and sources my professors each individually liked. And then I tailored my papers to each professor so that I'd get a better grade, which was not really about the quality of my work. It was about knowing what that professor liked.
Huh,
but
that feels very Slytherin.
To a certain extent, it wasn't, but to a certain extent, it wasn't actually conscious. My grandfather was a professor, and he started teaching me this kind of thing when I was like 4. So, like, I mean, there are some teachers who love it when you sit in front and raise your hand all the time and ask lots of questions. And there are some teachers who just let them get through the lecture. Once they're done with their lecture, then you can ask questions, that's fine. But don't interrupt them, that kind of thing. And so you figure out which teacher likes what. And then you tailor yourself to them a little bit. I mean, still remain yourself, but you do that kind of thing.
I was like super...
And as it happens, you usually wind up getting a better grade that way, which doesn't hurt. And also having the better relationship with them means that you can ask them questions about what confuses you more easily. I don't think that's necessarily evil. I think you can do that innocently, and I think I tried
I totally didn't do it at all in high school. I had math teachers like yell at me.
I had math teachers yell at me too. I'm not saying it always worked.
I don't think that cunning is evil. I think that there's, like you said, a very important place for wise as serpents. The very best of nonviolent resistance, I think, is wise as serpents, cunning as doves.
Yeah.
No, innocent as doves.
Innocent as a badger?
Ooh, yeah. I said cunning as doves, which does not work.
They are not, no. Don't switch those things up. That's not going to end well for anyone.
So make sure you get the right phrasing there.
Also, I find this saying particularly hilarious when you remember that a dove is just another word for pigeon. And if you've ever spent any time in a major American city surrounded by pigeons, pigeons are not necessarily perceived as innocent.
Yeah, definitely not.
But yeah.
The second part of verse 2, where Paul's talking about, but by the open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God, reminded me of Harry's Quibbler article and the way that he finally is like, no, you know what? And I mean, because of Hermione, right? But like finally just says, here's an open statement of the truth. here's what really happened. Here's the whole story. Read it, know it. I'm done, like, pretending, hiding, being quiet about this. And, it had pretty rough consequences. Both Paul and Harry had some really rough consequences with their truths. As
Paul kept landing in jail and falling out of ships. So, yeah.
So it was pretty rough, and Harry did not have an easy time with Professor Umbridge at all. Our gospel reading for Transfiguration Sunday is Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36, and some might also include verses 37 through 43. Peter, John, and James witness Jesus' conversation with Moses and Elijah on the mountaintop, followed by more proof of his identity through an exorcism. One of the things that I think about with the Transfiguration story and with Jesus being transfigured is the way that this is this huge and yet invisible change. So it's, right, Jesus has this huge shift, and yet when they walk down the mountain, nobody knows about what happened. And Luke even says they didn't tell anyone what had happened. And so people are coming up to Jesus as if nothing has changed. And it's similar to the way that Sirius' death impacts Harry, especially at the end of Order of the Phoenix, where all of this stuff has happened, but so many people have no idea what Sirius meant to him, or what like his role in the ministry magic was. And so nobody at school can really get what this transformation that he's been through, and they don't even know what they're missing, right? So I think about the ways, also as a queer person, and particularly as I have come out as non-binary first to myself, right? The, like, coming out to yourself before you're ready to come out to other people, and the way that shifts, like, how you internally are understanding yourselves and your deeper understanding of who you are, but nobody else knows that yet. And so there's this, like, cognitive dissonance, I think, that I imagine Jesus feels when he's like, God just reminded me that, yep, I'm on your side, and now nobody knows, like, what's going on.
Well, and he must have had that through his entire ministry. Gracious, the constant, disciples getting stuff wrong and not understanding what things really mean, and wow.
Yep.
Speaking of people getting things wrong, when we reach verse 29, and we get this bit about his clothes becoming dazzling white, we have talked before in this podcast about the difficulties of using light and darkness and the racial overtones that has had in history. And in this particular case, I would like to point out that when Jesus' clothes become dazzling white, please think very hard about the difficulty of doing laundry in ancient Palestine, and how they didn't have house elves or magic or even bleach. And so getting your clothes dazzling white, like even when you were making them fresh off the sheep, that was really unlikely. And so this is an example of Jesus becoming more than human, being, well, frankly, transfigured, like we said that he was going to be. This is an example of proving that Jesus isn't just a normal person. I mean, yes, human, but also more than that. And it doesn't have anything to do with the idea that the color white is inherently good, because it's not. It's just that this is showing that Jesus is more than previously met the eye.
Yep, and possibly so, yeah.
And then when we reach verse 32, I love this bit of the story of the disciples getting sleepy and falling asleep. Not because it was a good idea for them to do that, because it wasn't, but I love the fact that the disciples are human, and they make mistakes, and they do ordinary human stuff. And getting sleepy while dealing with this incredible, extraordinary thing going on right next to them is totally something that people do, How many times have you almost fallen asleep during something that was magnificently important to your life?
Oh, tons. Yep.
Yeah. And so it reminds me so much of Ron and Harry getting sleepy in, for example, divination class. And I just love that. I guess you can get bored anywhere.
It's true.
So
when I was thinking about the different times, Harry has so many dreams in the books, but there are occasionally ones where he actually doesn't remember them when he wakes up. And those ones I think are fascinating, that he's so sleepy that, like, when he turns over and goes back to sleep, he has no recollection of it in the morning. Just kind of, because there aren't many of them, because he remembers so many of them, but because we're, not Harry, we get to actually remember them, and the narrator tells us. And then he, like, didn't remember it at all. I think particularly in Prisoner of Azkaban, he has some of that. In the second part of the gospel, when we're encountering the man whose only son is his only child, has a spirit that seizes him and he shrieks out and stuff, that reminded me both of two of Malfoy's attempts to kill Dumbledore in the Half-Blood Prince, when both with the cursed necklace that Katie Bell accidentally touches and then, like, shrieks and screams and seems to be possessed, and then also with the poisoned wine that Slughorn was going to give to Dumbledore, but that Ron ended up drinking and almost dying first.
Thanks, Slughorn.
And the, like, foaming at the mouth and stuff. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the season of Lent in our first-year anniversary podcast.
Woo!
Yay! We'll have one or two other special things going on during that episode, too.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes up on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles, so make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review, or both, on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/HPATCHURCH.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax Vobiscum.